Kim Philby hid his true identity for decades, but when his dark lies caught up to him, the fallout was too brutal for any MI6 report. Born in India in the British Raj, his father was the famed explorer St. John Philby. Kim touched many corners of the empire in his early years, from his birthplace in India to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula to the prestigious schools of England. But while he grew up in the midst of the empire, he would turn his back on it before long. After graduating from Trinity College, Cambridge, Philby became a devoted activist. He started working with groups that provided relief to victims of fascism in Germany, and the experience would change him forever. While helping refugees in Vienna, Kim Philby fell in love. Her name was Litzy Friedman, and she was unlike anyone he'd ever met before. From the moment he laid eyes on her, Philby suddenly found himself on the path that would end decades later with him a hollow alcoholic wreck in an apartment in Moscow. Friedman was a frank person, and she instantly made an impression on Philby. Right when they met, she abruptly asked him how much money he had on him. He replied £100, hopefully enough to keep him going for a year in Vienna. Friedman did some quick math in her head and concluded he only needed £75 and told him to donate the rest to the International Organisation for Aid for Revolutionaries. Suddenly his life was entwined with this young, fiery revolutionary. Philby and Friedman married in 1934 just as their world fell apart around them. Fascists won the Austrian Civil War and Vienna was no longer safe for people like them. They fled back to England before they found themselves rotting in a cell, or worse. Not long after Philby and his new wife returned to England, another mysterious figure appeared in London. Arnold Deutsch, an Austrian academic, arrived from Vienna to study at University College London. What the university didn't know was that Deutsch had a secret agenda. He was a Soviet agent, there to recruit England's brightest young minds. Minds like Kim Philby's. In June 1934, Litzy Friedman told Philby that she had arranged a meeting with a man of decisive importance. Philby pressed her further, but she never said anything more than that. Soon after, he went to London's Regent's Park, where he met a man who called himself Otto. Philby wouldn't learn this was Deutsch until years later. Such a clandestine affair might have unsettled many men, but Philby couldn't help but be intrigued. Recalling the meeting years later, Otto clearly impressed the young Philby. He seemed cultured and intelligent. Deutsch spoke at length of how much he hated London and how much he adored Paris. He was looking for idealistic Brits to work for the Soviets, and he found his man in Kim Philby. Not only did Philby agree to become a Soviet agent, he also suggested some of his colleagues for recruitment, the men who would become the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring. Philby became a journalist working at various English papers. At this point, Moscow had little use for him, but the world was about to be thrown on its head, and Philby's day would come. Philby and Litzy Friedman fell in love as two young idealists, but their spark fizzled as everyday life settled in. They separated not long after Philby became a Soviet agent. It was probably for the best. There was nothing in Philby's future but paranoia, fear, and sorrow. The outbreak of the Spanish Civil War finally provided Philby an opportunity to be of use to the Soviets. He travelled to Seville and covered the conflict for the Times. While working from Spain, Philby would secretly send intel to his Soviet handlers in Paris by writing loosely coded letters to a fake girlfriend. The Russians weren't the only people who wanted what Philby knew. In a remarkable twist, he also started feeding information to the British government. If Philby didn't realise what he'd gotten into when Arnold Deutsch recruited him in 1934, he got a stark reminder in 1937. Stalin had Philby's handler in Paris neutralised as part of a violent purge of Soviet officials. His next handler met the same fate just 2 years later. Whether he liked it or not, Philby was in the middle of the Viper's den, but he wasn't about to back out now. Eventually, Philby's handler gave him a nearly impossible mission: neutralize the Spanish general, Francisco Franco. Such an event would likely have altered the course of history, but alas, this plan was doomed from the start. Soviet handlers instructed Philby to examine Franco's movements and assess vulnerable points in his security. However, after actually meeting with Philby in London, his handler reported back to the NKVD, the KGB of the time, and gave a damning assessment. His handler admitted that Philby was devoted and ready to sacrifice himself for the Soviet cause, but an elite assassin, he was not. The handler noted that Philby lacked, among other things, the physical courage to take out Franco. There was danger around every corner in Spain, and it was only a matter of time before the conflict caught up with Philby. Near the end of 1937, he and some other journalists were travelling by car when a Republican shell landed directly in front, exploding on impact. There were 4 men inside, all of them journalists, and only Philby survived. It was a terrifying ordeal, but in a bizarre twist of fate, it turned out to have a silver lining. After surviving an attack from the hated Republicans, Philby earned the respect of Franco's forces. Franco himself gave Philby a medal, and suddenly this secret communist agent was rubbing elbows with Spain's fascist elite. In 1938, one of Philby's comrades, a Soviet intelligence officer named Walter Krivitsky, defected to France. He became infamous for publishing an account of life in Stalin's secret service. But that wasn't all he knew. He knew that Moscow had infiltrated the ranks of many Western institutions, and he knew that a certain British journalist covering the conflict in Spain was a secret Soviet agent. With Walter Krivitsky spilling secrets to British intelligence, Kim Philby seemed doomed. But before he could actually be implicated in anything, Krivitsky turned up dead in a hotel in Washington. Philby was safe, but for how long? Soon after Krivitsky defected, Philby's own handler, the sinister Alexander Orlov, defected as well. Orlov had worked with Philby directly and easily could have named him, but he understood the grave consequences if he did. Orlov couldn't get his family out of the USSR. To ensure their safety, he kept his secrets to himself, including Philby's identity. Amazingly, Stalin respected this agreement. He wasn't even 30 yet, and Philby had almost been outed as a spy several times, and the chaos showed no signs of slowing down. The outbreak of World War II finally provided Philby the chance to become the Soviet spy he'd spent years trying to be. He'd made enough of a name for himself as a journalist that he landed a job working for MI6, Britain's top intelligence agency. Finally, 6 years after his recruitment, the Soviets' faith in Philby paid off. They had their mole. Though still technically married to Litzy Friedman, he moved in with Aileen Furse around the time he joined MI6. The couple had 3 children before Philby and Friedman finally made their divorce final. 2 more little ones came after that. Furse didn't know her husband was living a lie, and his secret life would eventually tear hers apart. The Russians had been keeping their distance from Philby for the previous few years, but once Philby was working for the British Special Operations Executive, they suddenly saw value in him. They sent their resident spy in London to reconnect with him after years of silence, and Philby became a double agent in earnest. He spent his days training British operatives, all the while feeding information to his Soviet handlers. Both the British and the Russians benefited from Philby's intelligence. His work affected strategy all across Europe, from Moscow to Gibraltar to Northern Africa. He pleased both his Soviet handlers and his British superiors. But while technically the 2 nations he worked for fought for the same side, tensions continued to grow. As World War II neared its conclusion, British intelligence became increasingly aware that the Russians could quickly go from ally to adversary. Once the threat of the Axis powers had faded, the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism was likely going to rear its head once again. In 1944, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service reactivated Section 9. The department had one goal: fighting communism. And guess who the SIS chose to lead the unit? It's almost unbelievable that MI6 would allow a double agent like Kim Philby to rise through their ranks. In fact, it's so unbelievable that Russian intelligence started getting suspicious. A KGB agent went over Philby's files and found them all too good to be true, and deduced that Philby was actually a double agent, and that his true allegiance lay with Britain. The truth was far simpler. British intelligence messed up big time. In August 1945, Philby received an assignment that must have sent a chill down his spine. A Soviet agent named Konstantin Volkov was defecting to Britain. He claimed to have the names of 3 other agents working in Britain, one of whom worked for MI6. The Brits desperately wanted those names, so they put one of their best men on it, Kim Philby himself. Philby's superiors told him to travel to Istanbul to deal with Volkov personally. The Volkov assignment put Philby in an impossible position. He was in charge of getting the names of Soviet agents out of Volkov while totally aware that one of those names was his own. He only had one option. He had to neutralise Volkov while somehow making it look like he had nothing to do with it. It looked like it was going to be the most dangerous mission of his entire life, except by the time Philby arrived in Istanbul, Volkov was already gone, tracked down by the Russians and whisked off to Moscow never to be seen again. By all accounts, British intelligence seemed to think that Kim Philby was doing an outstanding job for them. In 1946, he earned the prestigious Order of the British Empire. To this point, Philby had managed to work as a Soviet agent for over a decade without really getting his hands dirty, but that doesn't mean he was simply some innocent idealist. Philby was cold-blooded and methodical in his work. For one mission, he sent agents into Albania for the British, while secretly setting them up to fail for the Soviets. In essence, he knowingly sent men to their deaths. Eventually, MI6 relocated Philby and his family to the United States. The new job offered the Philbys a chance to get a fresh start, and a chance for Philby to provide new intel to the Russians. What he didn't know, however, was that his transfer to the US marked the beginning of the end. Philby and the other Soviet agents in British intelligence lived on a razor's edge. Sooner or later, someone was bound to slip up. A careless mistake by a Russian clerk revealed crucial information to the Brits. A Soviet agent in the British Embassy, who went by the codename Homer, met a handler in New York City twice a week. When Philby heard about the leak, he knew exactly who the Soviet agent was: Don McLean. As a British agent, he should have passed that info along and had McLean apprehended. As a Soviet agent, he had to protect McLean at all costs. To make matters worse, Western intelligence apprehended several Soviet spies around this time, putting him even more at risk. The walls were closing in. As everything was falling apart, a man named Guy Burgess arrived in Washington. He'd been friends with Philby since their college days, and he too was a double agent working for both the British and the Soviets. Guy Burgess quickly made a name for himself in Washington, for all the wrong reasons. His abrasive personality and constant drinking got him in trouble with the law on numerous occasions. His presence caused a serious problem for Philby, but that wasn't even the worst of it. He stayed at the Philby household while he was there, and the two men drank away their days as they tried to figure out what to do about McLean. Finally, Philby came up with a desperate plan. He'd send Burgess back to England where he would warn McLean. Fortunately, he didn't need to come up with a good excuse to get rid of Burgess. The man got 3 speeding tickets in one day, and the British Embassy sent him back to England out of embarrassment. MI6 was closing in on McLean, and Burgess hadn't yet gotten him out of England. A desperate Philby sent Burgess a barely coded telegram telling him to move his convertible before it was too late. Not long after, Burgess drove to McLean's house, picked him up, and the two of them fled to Moscow. The plan was for McLean to flee and for Burgess to stay in England, but Philby's telegram must have spooked him. Now, two British diplomats, one of whom was strongly suspected of being a Soviet agent, had vanished and turned up in Moscow. The other diplomat happened to be very close to Kim Philby, a high-ranking member of British intelligence. Philby had a lot of questions to answer, and his superiors called him back to London. Philby vehemently denied all accusations that he was in cahoots with Burgess and McLean, though he still resigned his position. His once extravagant life went down the drain after Burgess and McLean fled to Moscow. Out of work, he and his family found themselves struggling to make ends meet, which made him turn to the bottle more and more. Aileen's mental health worsened and she developed a serious drinking problem as well. Their marriage fell apart and Aileen left. His wife had suffered from psychological episodes since she was young, and having a paranoid, hard-drinking husband like Philby certainly didn't help. She'd been coping with her mental illness for a time, but after a while it finally became too much for her to bear. She died in 1957 at the age of 46. Her friends believed she'd taken her own life, but her psychiatrist suspected that she'd been murdered, perhaps for knowing too much. The official cause of death was ruled to be heart failure, with alcoholism being a factor. As if struggling to find work and his wife leaving him wasn't enough, the Soviets, for whom he'd sacrificed everything, cast him aside. He was of no use to them as a sporadically employed freelance journalist. But it wasn't the end of Kim Philby. Not yet. Believe it or not, the British government eventually announced that Philby was completely innocent of all suspicion. They concluded he hadn't acted with Burgess and McLean and publicly exonerated him. Even crazier, he started working for them again. They sent him to Beirut, where he would find a whole new world of intrigue waiting for him. In Beirut, Philby embarked on an affair with Eleanor Brewer, the wife of an American journalist. Eventually, Eleanor left her husband and moved in with Philby. They married and set themselves up in Beirut. But just like his last marriage, it wouldn't end well. After so many close calls, Philby's double life finally caught up with him in 1961. A Soviet defector revealed what so many had suspected for so long: Philby had been working with the Russians the whole time. British intelligence sent word to Nicholas Elliott, an MI6 officer in Beirut and a close friend of Philby's. Elliott had believed in his friend's innocence the entire time, and now it was up to him to get Philby to confess. By the time his secrets came to light, Philby was already a shell of a man. He fell into a deep depression and drank almost every day. When Nicholas Elliott arrived to confront him, Philby admitted everything. But when Elliott asked him to sign a written confession, he refused. He begged Elliott to delay the official interrogation, and they scheduled a meeting in late January. When the time came, Philby didn't show up. Days earlier, he had vanished without a trace, and months later, he finally surfaced again in Moscow. Remarkably, Eleanor Philby didn't abandon her husband after his disgrace. She visited him in Moscow and actually made plans to move there with him permanently, but they couldn't salvage their marriage by this point. They divorced soon after her second visit to Russia. Kim Philby spent almost his entire life in service of the Soviet Union, but he faced a harsh reality when he finally found himself living there. Far from being a hero, the Soviets treated him with suspicion and hostility, in case he was secretly acting as a British spy. Philby lived out the rest of his days in the Soviet Union as a depressed, alcoholic wreck. He filled his days working with the KGB, ensuring that the propaganda they disseminated into England sounded properly and believably English. When he died in 1988, he was given a hero's funeral. He always considered himself a communist and anti-imperialist, but when he saw what life was like in Moscow, he was supposedly disappointed at how people lived, saying the ideals were right, but the way they were carried out was wrong. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.